Have you ever stood up for what's right even when everyone else was laughing? I still remember that day in Mrs. Wilson's classroom like it was yesterday. The silence that fell over 28 sixth graders as I stood up from my desk. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode right out of my chest. I wasn't brave. I wasn't popular. I was just a kid from the east side of town. The wrong side, as some would say. The kid with the free lunch tickets and the hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit right. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. Nobody expected anything from me. I was just the quiet, poor kid who sat in the back corner, trying to become invisible. But sometimes the most unexpected courage comes from the most unexpected places. What happened next changed not just that classroom, but my entire life. But let me take you back to how it all began. My name is Alex Martinez. I grew up in Oakwood Heights, a neighborhood in Portland where the houses get smaller and the problems get bigger. My mom worked 3 jobs just to keep our tiny 2-bedroom apartment, which I shared with my 2 younger sisters. Dad wasn't in the picture, hadn't been since I was 7. Every morning I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to help Mom get the girls ready before she left for her first shift at the hospital cafeteria. Then I'd walk them to elementary school before heading to Westlake Middle School myself. School was, well, it was a place I had to be, not somewhere I wanted to be. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't standing out either, just floating somewhere in the middle, trying not to draw attention to myself. The worn-out backpack, the same 3 rotating shirts, the sneakers held together with duct tape. Kids notice these things. They always do. Not everyone was mean about it, but enough were that I learned to keep my head down. But there was one place I felt at home, the library. During lunch period, when the cafeteria became a battleground of social hierarchies, I'd slip away to the quiet safety of books. That's where I first met Nathan Chen. Nathan was everything I wasn't: brilliant, focused, and completely oblivious to the social currents around him. His clothes were always pristine, his homework always perfect, and his hand always the first one in the air when teachers asked questions. His parents were both doctors at the university hospital, and everyone knew he was headed for great things. We weren't friends, not really. Just 2 outcasts who found refuge in the same place. He'd read advanced physics books while I lost myself in adventure stories. We'd nod at each other sometimes, but that was about it. The real story began on a Tuesday in October. The air was turning crisp, leaves were changing, and there was that sense of anticipation before the first real cold snap of fall. I remember it so clearly because it was picture day, and my mom had scraped together enough money to buy me a new shirt, dark blue with tiny white stripes. It wasn't fancy, but it was new, and I felt almost normal wearing it. Mrs. Wilson's English class was right after lunch. She was one of those teachers who really cared. You could tell by how she'd stay after school to help kids who were struggling, or how she remembered details about your life that you'd mentioned months ago. That day, we were presenting our creative writing assignments, short stories we'd spent a week working on. The classroom was buzzing with the usual energy. Jason Reeves and his crew, the kings of 6th grade, were lounging in the back row, looking bored and intimidating as usual. The pretty girls were clustered together, giggling and whispering. The athletes, the artsy kids, the gamers, everyone in their usual spots. And then there was me, sliding into my desk near the window, and Nathan, front and center with his story neatly typed and proofread. "All right, everyone, settle down," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Who wants to share their story first?" No one raised their hand, of course. No one ever does. Mrs. Wilson smiled like she expected this. "How about Nathan? Would you like to start us off?" Nathan beamed. Unlike the rest of us, he actually enjoyed being called on. He stood up, pushed his glasses up his nose, and walked to the front of the class with his papers clutched to his chest. "My story is called The Quantum Explorer," he began, his voice a little too loud, a little too enthusiastic. I noticed Jason and his friends already smirking at each other. Nathan's story was, well, it was exactly what you'd expect from him. It was about a scientist who discovers how to travel between dimensions using quantum physics. It was actually pretty cool if you were into that sort of thing, with lots of detailed explanations about parallel universes and time paradoxes. He'd clearly put his whole heart into it. But about halfway through, I heard the snickering start. It was Jason first, then his buddy Tyler, then the rest of their group. Little huffs of laughter, exaggerated eye rolls, mimed yawns. Nathan kept reading, his voice getting smaller, his cheeks getting redder. And as Dr. Martinez calibrated the quantum field generator, Nathan continued, "Nerd alert." Someone coughed out just loud enough to be heard. A wave of laughter rippled through the room. Mrs. Wilson frowned. "That's enough. Let's respect each other's work, please." Nathan tried to continue, but his voice was shaking now. The reading showed an anomalous, English, please," Tyler called out, and more laughter followed. I watched Nathan's face crumple. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a single friendly face and finding none. Even Mrs. Wilson seemed at a loss, her usual authority momentarily stunned by the casual cruelty unfolding. "Maybe Dr. Dorkenstein can find a universe where he's not a total loser," Jason said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter grew louder. Nathan stood there, papers trembling in his hands, looking so small and alone that something inside me just broke. I don't know what came over me. I'd spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, of never drawing attention to myself. But before I knew what was happening, I was on my feet. "Shut up, Jason." My voice rang out clear and sharp, surprising even me. The laughter cut off abruptly. 28 pairs of eyes swiveled to stare at me. I felt my face burning, my hands shaking. But somehow I kept going. "His story is better than anything you could write. At least he's smart enough to understand what he's talking about instead of just making fun of people to hide how dumb you are." The silence that followed was deafening. Jason's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. "What did you say? Charity case?" My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it. I'd finally done it. I'd made myself a target. But somehow now that I'd started, I couldn't stop. I said, "Leave him alone." I took a deep breath. Nathan's story is awesome. It's creative and smart and interesting. And even if it wasn't, he doesn't deserve to be treated like this. None of us do. Jason stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was at least 4 inches taller than me, and everyone knew his dad was some big-shot businessman who donated to the school. "You defending your boyfriend, Martinez?" I felt the familiar shame trying to crawl back in, the instinct to duck my head and disappear. But something had changed. I thought about my sisters, about how I always told them to stand up for themselves and each other. What kind of example was I setting if I couldn't even follow my own advice? He's not my boyfriend. He's a kid in our class who deserves the same respect as anyone else. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of my classmates. How would any of you feel if it was you up there? If everyone was laughing while you were just trying to share something you worked hard on? A few kids looked down, uncomfortable. Others were watching with wide eyes, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Nathan was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mrs. Wilson finally seemed to recover. "That's enough, Jason. Sit down." "Alex, thank you, but I'll handle this." But I wasn't done. 6 years of hiding, of taking the path of least resistance, of swallowing my words, it all came pouring out. "No, Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry, but this isn't right. Every day someone in this room gets laughed at or picked on because they're different, or they don't have the right clothes, or they're too smart or not smart enough. And we all just let it happen because we're afraid we'll be next." I was shaking, but I kept going. Nathan wrote an amazing story about science and exploration and discovery, and instead of appreciating how much work he put into it or how creative it is, all some people can do is try to tear him down to make themselves feel bigger. The silence stretched on. I waited for the laughter, the jeers, for Jason or one of his friends to put me in my place. But then something extraordinary happened. Maddie Chen, no relation to Nathan, just a coincidence, raised her hand. Maddie was one of the popular girls, always perfectly dressed, always surrounded by friends. Mrs. Wilson nodded at her, looking as surprised as I felt. "I thought Nathan's story was cool," Maddie said. "I didn't understand all the science stuff, but I liked the part about the different versions of the same person across dimensions. It made me think." Then Troy Washington, our star basketball player, spoke up. "Yeah, it reminded me of that movie we watched in science last week. The multiverse one." One by one, other kids started chiming in, sharing what they'd liked about Nathan's story. Not everyone. Jason and his friends were sullen and silent, but enough. Nathan's face transformed, disbelief giving way to the beginnings of a smile. And then Lily Santos started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster. Others joined in. Troy, Maddie, kids whose names I barely knew. Even Mrs. Wilson was applauding, her eyes suspiciously bright. For a moment, our classroom wasn't divided into the usual tribes and territories. For a moment, we were just kids, recognizing something good and true when we saw it. Nathan finished his story, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. When he was done, the applause was genuine and warm. As he made his way back to his seat, he caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." I just nodded, still not quite believing what had happened. Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat. "Well, that was wonderful, Nathan. Thank you for sharing your story with us." She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on me. "I think we've all learned something important today, and it wasn't just about quantum physics." The rest of the class period passed in a blur. Other students shared their stories, the atmosphere noticeably gentler, more attentive. Even Jason seemed subdued, though the glares he shot my way promised this wasn't over. When the bell rang, I gathered my things slowly, dreading the hallway confrontation that surely awaited me. But as I headed for the door, Mrs. Wilson called my name. "Alex, could you stay for a moment, please?" I hung back as the other students filed out. Nathan hesitated in the doorway, looking like he wanted to say something but then hurried on. Once we were alone, Mrs. Wilson gestured for me to sit at a desk near her. "What you did today," she said, "was one of the bravest things I've seen in 30 years of teaching." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just got tired of it, I guess. Standing up for others when there's a personal cost, that's real courage, Alex. She studied me for a moment. "You know, I've always thought there was more to you than meets the eye. You're a good writer too, you know. Your story about the lighthouse keeper, it was beautiful." I felt my face warm at the compliment. My story had been about a lonely lighthouse keeper who saved a village during a storm, even though they'd always ostracized him. It wasn't as sophisticated as Nathan's, but I'd poured myself into it. "Thanks," I mumbled. "I mean it. You have a real talent." She hesitated. "Alex, I've been meaning to talk to you about the middle school writing competition. The deadline is next month, and I think you should consider entering." I blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Yes, you. The winner gets a scholarship to the summer writing program at Portland State, and I think you'd have a real shot." She smiled at my incredulous expression. "Just think about it, okay? Sometimes we surprise ourselves with what we're capable of." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "A scholarship? Me? You'd better get to your next class. I'll write you a pass." As I headed to math class, my mind was spinning. The day had already been surreal enough, and now this? It was like I'd stepped into an alternate dimension, like one of the ones in Nathan's story. The rest of the day wasn't all roses and applause, of course. Jason made a point of shoving past me in the hallway, hissing, "This isn't over, charity case," as he went. But something fundamental had shifted. When Nathan sat next to me in the cafeteria the following day, his tray loaded with food his mom had packed, he didn't need to say anything. We just ate in comfortable silence. Two misfits who'd somehow found an unexpected alliance. But the real surprise came after school. I was walking my usual route home, bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation with Jason and his crew, when I rounded a corner and found not just them but what seemed like half the 6th grade waiting for me. My stomach dropped. This was it. The payback. I considered turning and running, but there was nowhere to go. So I straightened my shoulders and kept walking, trying to look braver than I felt. As I approached, the crowd parted, and there, in the center, stood Nathan, and beside him, surprisingly, was Maddie Chen. "Alex," Nathan said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "We wanted to thank you properly." I looked around warily. "Where's Jason?" "Detention," Maddie said with a small smile. "Mrs. Wilson heard what he said to you in the hallway." Nathan stepped forward. "What you did in class today? No one's ever stood up for me like that before." I shrugged, embarrassed. "It wasn't a big deal. It was to me," he said simply. Maddie nodded. "And to a lot of us. It made us think about the times we didn't say anything when we should have." Nathan held out a small box. "Anyway, we wanted to give you this. It's not much, but..." Confused, I opened it. Inside was a small notebook, bound in dark blue leather. On the first page, someone had written, "For Alex, who showed us what courage looks like." I looked up to find more kids approaching. Troy, Lily, others whose names I barely knew. Some had signed the notebook. Others just wanted to tell me they thought what I'd done was cool. Even a couple of kids who usually hung out with Jason were there, looking sheepish but sincere. "I don't understand," I said. Troy shrugged his massive shoulders. You made us see something we didn't want to see. About ourselves, you know? Lily nodded. It's like, we all just go along with stuff because it's easier. But you didn't. And maybe we don't have to either. It wasn't a huge Hollywood moment. There were no sweeping declarations or grand gestures. Just a bunch of ordinary kids standing on an ordinary street corner, grappling with the uncomfortable realization that they'd been complicit in something they knew wasn't right. And somehow, that made it all the more meaningful. That was 6 years ago. I'd like to say that moment transformed our school, that bullying disappeared and we all became one big happy family. But that's not how real life works. Jason didn't suddenly become a nice person. He still had his moments of cruelty, still wielded his social power like a weapon, but something had shifted in the ecosystem of our school. More and more, when he or others like him started in on someone, they'd find themselves facing not just silent discomfort, but actual opposition. As for me, I did enter that writing competition Mrs. Wilson suggested. I didn't win the top prize, but I got an honorable mention, which came with a partial scholarship to the summer program. My story was about a kid from the wrong side of the tracks who discovered he had the power to hear people's thoughts, but only when they were sad. It was part science fiction, part social commentary, inspired in part by my friendship with Nathan, which had grown deeper over the months. Nathan and I remained friends through middle school and beyond. He's at MIT now, studying theoretical physics, while I'm at Portland State on a writing scholarship. We still video chat every week, two former outcasts who found their voices in very different ways. Maddie Chen and I became friends too, bridging the gap between our very different social worlds. She helped me navigate the complex social landscape of high school, and I helped her see beyond the boundaries of her privileged bubble. She's studying international relations at Georgetown now, determined to make a difference on a global scale. My mom still works hard, but things got a bit easier when I started winning writing competitions in high school, some of which came with prize money that helped with bills. My sisters look up to me in a way I never expected, telling their friends about their big brother the writer. But the most important change wasn't external, it was inside me. That day in Mrs. Wilson's classroom, I discovered something about myself that I never knew existed. A core of strength and conviction that no hand-me-down clothes or free lunch tickets could diminish. I learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and speaking up anyway. It's about recognizing that some things are worth the risk of embarrassment, rejection, or even physical harm. I'm not saying everyone needs to be a hero, or that speaking up is always the right choice in every situation. Safety matters, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is survive. But I've come to believe that there are moments in life that define us, crossroads where we're forced to decide who we really are and what we stand for. And often these moments don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary days, ordinary decisions. For me, it was a Tuesday in October, a new blue shirt and a kid with glasses being laughed at for loving science too much. What will it be for you? I still have that notebook they gave me. It sits on my desk, a reminder of the day I found my voice. I filled it with stories, ideas, fragments of the life I'm still discovering. And on days when the world seems too harsh or overwhelming, I open it to that first page and read the inscription, "For Alex, who showed us what courage looks like." And I remember that sometimes the smallest actions can create the biggest ripples. That standing up once makes it easier to stand up again. That courage, like fear, is contagious. So this is my story. Not a tale of grand heroism or earth-shattering consequences, but of one ordinary moment when an ordinary kid decided that enough was enough. A moment that changed not just a classroom, but the trajectory of lives, mine included. And if there's one thing I've learned from both living this story and writing many others since, it's this. We are all, at every moment, writing our own stories with the choices we make. Big or small, seen or unseen, these choices matter. They shape us. They ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict. Choose wisely. Choose kindly when you can. And when you can't be kind, choose to be brave, because you never know who's watching, who needs to see that it can be done. You never know whose life might change direction because you had the courage to stand when everyone else sat silent. I'm proof of that. The poor kid from Oakwood Heights who found his voice defending a nerdy classmate and ended up finding himself in the process. What's your story going to be? When I think back to that moment in Mrs. Wilson's classroom, I'm struck by how close I came to saying nothing. How many times in life do we stand on the edge of transformation, one decision away from becoming a different version of ourselves? And how many times do we step back, choosing the safety of silence over the risk of speaking up? It's easy to romanticize that moment now, to cast myself as the hero of the story, but the truth is messier, more human. I was terrified. My voice shook. I very nearly backed down when Jason stood up. It wasn't a grand cinematic moment of triumph. It was a scared kid making a choice, uncertain of the consequences. That's what real courage looks like, I think. Not fearlessness, but fear acknowledged and faced. Not confidence, but doubt pushed through. The weeks following that day were complicated. Some kids treated me differently, with a new respect, yes, but also with a wariness, as if I'd disrupted the natural order of things. Jason and his friends made my life difficult in subtle ways. A shouldered check in the hallway, whispered comments, isolated moments of intimidation. There were days I regretted ever opening my mouth, but there were also unexpected allies. Troy Washington, all 6 feet of middle school basketball stardom, started walking with me between classes sometimes, just heading the same way, he'd say casually, but we both knew what he was doing. Maddie invited me to sit at her lunch table, bridging social divides that had seemed impenetrable, and Mrs. Wilson watched over it all with a quiet pride, stepping in when needed, but mostly letting us navigate the shifting social landscape ourselves. Nathan, for his part, blossomed. Not overnight. Social dynamics don't change that quickly, but gradually, as other kids discovered, there was more to him than his academic brilliance. He joined the Science Olympiad team and led them to the state championships. He still got occasional jabs about being too smart, but they lacked the former sting, tinged now with something closer to respect. We became an unlikely trio, Nathan, Maddie, and me. The nerd, the popular girl, and the poor kid from the east side. We didn't fit into any established social category, which somehow gave us freedom to create our own. By 8th grade, our study group had expanded to include Troy, Lily, and others who drifted between social circles. The summer before high school, something unexpected happened. My honorable mention in the writing competition caught the attention of a local literacy nonprofit. They offered me a paid internship helping run writing workshops for elementary school kids in underserved neighborhoods, including my own. Suddenly, I was getting paid to do what I loved, while giving back to my community. The first day of the program, I walked into the community center expecting to teach, but unprepared for how it would feel to see 20 young faces looking up at me. Kids who lived in the same apartment complex as me, who faced the same challenges, who needed to believe their voices mattered too. "I'm Alex," I said, my throat tight, "and I'm here because I believe everyone has a story worth telling." One little girl in the front row, maybe 7 years old with braided hair and serious eyes, raised her hand. "Even if you're not rich?" The question hit me right in the heart. "Especially then," I told her, "because your perspective is one people might not have heard before." I shared my own story that day. Not just the moment in Mrs. Wilson's class, but the before and after. The free lunch tickets and the hand-me-downs. The scholarship and the friendships that crossed boundaries. I told them about Nathan and his quantum physics, about Maddie and her journey outside her bubble of privilege. And I watched their eyes widen with possibility. That summer changed me as much as it changed them. I discovered I had a gift not just for writing, but for teaching others to find their voices. The kids in my workshop published a collection of stories and poems that was displayed at the public library. The local newspaper did a small feature on the program, including a photo of me surrounded by beaming children holding their published work. My mom framed that newspaper clipping. It hangs in our living room still, alongside my sister's artwork and school achievements. A family gallery of pride. High school brought new challenges, of course. The social dynamics were more complex. The stakes somehow higher, but the foundation had been laid. I knew who I was now, or at least who I was becoming. I joined the school newspaper, found my tribe in the creative writing club, maintained my unlikely friendships while forming new ones. There were still hard days. Days when the financial gulf between my life and those of many of my classmates became painfully apparent. I couldn't go on the ski trip, couldn't afford the latest fashion trends, worked evenings and weekends at the local grocery store, while others focused solely on school and social lives. But I had something many didn't: a sense of purpose, a voice I knew how to use, and increasingly recognition for my writing. Junior year, I won a national essay contest with a piece about economic inequality and education. The prize was $5,000 and publication in a prestigious magazine. When the check arrived, my mom cried. We used it to fix our ancient car and set aside the rest for college applications. Nathan and I applied to colleges together, hunched over laptops in the public library, proofreading each other's essays. His were brilliant analyses of scientific concepts, mine explorations of social issues and personal narratives. We got our acceptance letters the same week, him to MIT with a full scholarship, me to several state schools with varying financial aid packages. We celebrated with a midnight picnic on the elementary school playground, joined by Maddie and our other friends, all of us perched on swing sets and slides, talking about futures that once seemed impossible. Portland State offered me the best financial aid package, plus proximity to my family and the nonprofit where I'd continued to work throughout high school. The choice was clear, even as I felt twinges of envy for friends heading to more prestigious schools. But life has a way of working out in unexpected ways. My connection to the nonprofit led to an introduction to a professor in the English department who was looking for a research assistant. By the end of my freshman year, I was helping with a project on narrative approaches to social justice, my name included on a published academic paper. And that brings me back to now, junior year of college, 21 years old, still figuring it all out but with a clearer sense of direction than many. My life isn't perfect. Whose is? I still worry about money. Still feel the outsider sometimes in academic settings. My mom still works too hard, though only 2 jobs now instead of 3. My sisters are teenagers, navigating their own complex social landscapes with a confidence I never had at their age. But when I look back at that scared kid in Mrs. Wilson's classroom, I feel a deep tenderness and pride. He had no idea where that one moment of courage would lead. No concept of how speaking up once would make it easier to speak up again and again, until finding and using his voice became second nature. I've thought a lot about why I stood up that day. It wasn't just for Nathan, though he deserved defending. It wasn't just frustration with Jason and his casual cruelty, though that played a part. I think, at its core, it was about recognizing myself in Nathan's vulnerability. Different circumstances, different challenges, but the same essential experience of being made to feel less than, invisible, unworthy of basic dignity. In defending him, I was defending something in myself, too. The right to take up space, to be seen, to have value regardless of external markers of worth. That's the ripple effect of courage I've found. It doesn't just change the moment, it changes how you see yourself and your place in the world. It creates possibilities where none seemed to exist before. I don't tell this story to paint myself as exceptional. Just the opposite, in fact. I believe these moments of choice exist in everyone's life. The invitation to step up, speak out, stand for something. It comes to all of us in different forms. Sometimes we answer it. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we regret our choice. Sometimes it sets us on an entirely new path. I got lucky. My moment of courage was witnessed, validated, even celebrated. Not everyone gets that external affirmation, but the internal shift. That happens regardless of how others respond. Once you know you can stand up, you carry that knowledge forever. Last week I got an email from Mrs. Wilson. She's retiring next year, after 35 years of teaching. She wanted me to know that she still tells the story of that day in her classroom to her new students each year. Not to embarrass me or put me on a pedestal, but to illustrate that courage often comes from unexpected places, that it's available to anyone who chooses it. She also told me that Jason Reeves came back to visit her last year, now a college graduate himself. He asked about me, admitted that day had affected him too, though it took years for him to recognize it. He's teaching high school math now, with a particular focus on reaching struggling students. Life is strange that way. So that's my story. A small moment that led to bigger ones. A ripple that became a current, carrying me to places I never imagined. I've learned that we're all connected in ways we don't always see or understand. That kindness and courage create echoes that continue long after the initial act. That the most meaningful changes often start with the smallest choices. And I've learned that we all have the capacity to surprise ourselves, to be braver, kinder, more resilient than we ever thought possible. The notebook sits on my desk as I write these words. It's blue leather worn soft with years of handling. Inside are stories I've written, ideas I've explored, fragments of the person I'm still becoming. But the most important story isn't written on those pages. It's written in the choices I've made since that Tuesday in October. It's written in the lives that have touched mine and the lives I've touched in return. It's still being written every day, and so is yours. Whatever path you're on, whatever challenges you face, remember that you have a voice. It might shake, it might falter, it might sometimes fail you completely, but it's yours. And using it, even once, even in a small way, can change everything. Trust me, I know. What strikes me most about my journey isn't the external markers of success, the scholarships or publications or academic achievements. It's the internal transformation, the shift from seeing myself as powerless to recognizing my own agency, from believing I was defined by my circumstances to understanding I could help shape them. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't just that one moment in Mrs. Wilson's class. It was the accumulation of choices that followed. Some big, some small, all contributing to the person I was becoming. There were setbacks, of course. Times when my courage failed me. Times when I stayed silent when I should have spoken. When I took the easier path instead of the right one. I'm not proud of those moments, but they're part of my story too. Like the time in 9th grade when I overheard some kids making fun of a girl's accent. She had recently moved from the Dominican Republic, and I pretended not to hear. Or the time I laughed along with a joke that I knew was hurtful, because in that moment, fitting in felt more important than standing up. These failures haunted me. They still do sometimes, but I've learned to see them not as evidence of some fundamental flaw, but as reminders that courage is a muscle that needs constant exercise. That being brave once doesn't guarantee you'll be brave every time. That you have to keep choosing it, again and again. The summer after sophomore year of college, I had an opportunity to put these lessons to the test in a bigger arena. The nonprofit where I worked was facing funding cuts that would eliminate programs in the poorest neighborhoods, including the writing workshop that had meant so much to me and to the kids who participated. The old Alex would have accepted this as inevitable, another example of how the world works. The vulnerable always losing out when resources get tight. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I organized a group of current and former participants to speak at the county budget hearing. We prepared our statements together, practicing in the community center after hours. I coached 11-year-olds on projecting their voices, making eye contact, telling their stories with confidence. Together we crafted a narrative not of charity or need, but of investment and return. How the program had changed lives, created opportunities, built bridges between communities. The night of the hearing, I sat in the back of the room watching as, one by one, kids from my neighborhood approached the microphone. Some were nervous, voices quavering. Others spoke with surprising authority. All of them were magnificent in their authenticity. Maria, the girl who had asked if people who weren't rich could tell stories too, was now 13 and a gifted poet. She spoke last, reciting a piece she had written about finding her voice through words. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, before erupting in applause. The budget committee voted unanimously to restore funding. Afterward, as we celebrated with pizza at the community center, Maria sat next to me. "You know," she said, "when you first told us your story about standing up in class, I didn't really get it, but I think I do now." "Get what?" I asked. "How one person speaking up can make other people brave too." She looked around at the other kids, laughing and talking excitedly about their victory. Like, if you hadn't done it first, maybe none of this would have happened. Her words hit me with unexpected force. I'd never fully considered the true extent of how actions ripple outward, creating possibilities not just for ourselves but for others. How courage, once witnessed, becomes more attainable. How speaking up creates space for other voices to join in. It made me think about Nathan, about how his courage to be authentically himself, even when it made him a target, had been a different kind of bravery. About how Mrs. Wilson's small acts of kindness and recognition had created the conditions for my moment of standing up. About how we're all constantly influencing each other's stories in ways we might never fully understand. The world can seem overwhelming sometimes. The problems too big, the divisions too deep. The injustice is too entrenched. In those moments, it's easy to believe that our individual choices don't matter, that one voice can't possibly make a difference in the face of such complexity. But my experience has taught me otherwise. I've seen how a single moment of courage in a middle school classroom created a ripple that's still expanding years later. How one kid refusing to be a silent bystander changed not just his own trajectory, but touched countless other lives in ways both seen and unseen. I think about this whenever I feel small or powerless. I remember that day in Mrs. Wilson's class, and it reminds me that history, both personal and collective, is made up of individual choices, that systems and cultures are changed not just through grand gestures and sweeping movements, but through ordinary people deciding in ordinary moments that they will not participate in what they know to be wrong. Nathan and I talk about this sometimes during our weekly video chats. He's thriving at MIT, his brilliance now recognized and celebrated. Last month, he won a prestigious research grant for his work on quantum computing applications. The awkward, bullied kid who once stood trembling before a classroom of peers is now confidently presenting his research at international conferences. You know, he told me recently, I still think about that day. What might have happened if you hadn't said anything? You would have been fine, I assured him. You were always going to succeed. He shook his head, maybe academically. But that day changed something fundamental for me. It showed me that I deserved to take up space, that my interests and passions weren't something to be ashamed of. He paused, adjusting his glasses in a gesture that reminded me of his 12-year-old self. It's affected how I mentor younger students now, how I create space for different kinds of thinking and being in my lab. That's how change works, I think. Not in dramatic, cinematic moments, but in these quiet transmissions of possibility. In the small ways we show each other what's possible. My life continues to evolve in ways I couldn't have predicted. My writing has opened doors I never imagined would be available to someone like me. Last year I published my first collection of short stories, tales of ordinary people facing moments of choice, of courage both dramatic and subtle. The dedication reads, for Mrs. Wilson, who saw what others didn't, for Nathan, who taught me about courage by simply being himself, and for the kids of Oakwood Heights, whose stories are still waiting to be told. The book has done well enough that I was able to help my mom put a down payment on a small house, the first property our family has ever owned. The day we got the keys, she stood in the empty living room, running her hands over walls that belonged to us, and cried. You did this, she said, but I know better. I didn't do it alone. I am the product of my mother's relentless sacrifice and determination, of Mrs. Wilson's belief in a quiet kid with a knack for words, of Nathan's friendship and Maddie's bridge building and the community that formed around us, of Maria and the other kids from the writing workshop who showed me the power of my own story by claiming theirs. We are all, always, co-creating each other's possibilities. As for Jason, our paths crossed again last summer at a teaching conference. I was there representing the nonprofit, running a workshop on narrative approaches to youth empowerment. He was there with a cohort from his school district. We spotted each other across the hotel lobby, both momentarily frozen in recognition. He approached first, hand extended. Alex Martinez, I heard you published a book. I nodded, shaking his hand. And I heard you're teaching math now, focusing on struggling students. A flash of surprise crossed his face. Word gets around, I guess. We found ourselves sitting in the hotel bar that evening, two adults processing shared childhood memories through the lens of years and growth. I was a real jerk back then, he said, staring into his beer. Yeah, you were, I agreed, which made him laugh. I deserved that. He was quiet for a moment. My dad was, well, he was a lot like I was, demanding, critical. Nothing was ever good enough. He looked up, not an excuse, just context. We were kids, I said. We were all figuring it out, some better than others. He sighed. You know that day in Wilson's class? It stuck with me, not right away. I was too busy being angry and embarrassed. But eventually, he traced a pattern in the condensation on his glass. It was the first time anyone had really called me on my behavior, made me see myself the way others might see me. We talked for hours, filling in the gaps of our divergent life paths. How he'd struggled in college, nearly flunked out before finding a mentor who believed in him. How teaching had become his unexpected passion and redemption. how he now looked for the Nathans in his classroom, the kids with minds that worked differently, who didn't fit neatly into the system, and for the Alexis, the quiet ones with unexpected depths. I tell them the story sometimes, he admitted. I don't use names, but I tell them about a kid who taught me one of the most important lessons of my life, about how we all have the capacity to be better than we are in any given moment. It was surreal, sitting there with someone who had once been my tormentor, now sharing a kind of grudging mutual respect. Not friendship exactly, but recognition of our shared humanity and the strange winding paths that had brought us to this point. As we parted ways, he said something that has stayed with me. You know what's weird? If you think about it, that moment, you standing up, me being a jerk, it changed both our lives, just in different ways. He was right, of course. Our choices don't just affect others, they shape us too. Every time we speak up or stay silent, stand firm or look away, we're not just influencing the external situation, we're forming our own character, setting patterns that become easier to follow with repetition. What I couldn't have known on that Tuesday in October was that I wasn't just defending Nathan, I was defining myself, making a declaration about who I was and who I wanted to be. Every choice that followed, entering the writing competition, mentoring younger kids, speaking at the budget hearing, became easier because I had already proven to myself that I could act with courage when it mattered. And now, as I prepare to graduate college and move into whatever comes next, I carry that knowledge with me, not as a burden of expectation, but as a source of quiet strength. A reminder that even when the challenges seem insurmountable, I have within me the capacity to act, to speak, to make a difference, however small. This is the legacy of that moment in Mrs. Wilson's classroom. Not fame or acclaim or dramatic transformation, but the steady accumulation of choices aligned with my deepest values, the gradual becoming of the person I aspired to be. So if you're standing at a similar crossroads, witnessing injustice, feeling the pull to speak up alongside the fear of consequences, know this: your choice matters, not just for the situation at hand, but for the person you are becoming, for the example you set, for the ripples that will continue long after the moment has passed. You may not see the full impact of your courage. You may never know all the lives you touch, all the possibilities you create, but they exist nonetheless. I've learned that courage, like fear, compounds over time. Each brave act makes the next one slightly easier. Each time we align our actions with our values, we strengthen the connection between who we are and who we aspire to be. So this is my challenge to you, as it was once my challenge to myself. Find your voice. Use it, even when it shakes. Especially when it shakes. Because in doing so, you give others permission to find and use theirs too. The change may not be immediate or dramatic. It rarely is. But in those small moments of courage, a raised hand, a dissenting voice, a kind word when cruelty would be easier, lives are shaped, communities are formed, futures are written, including your own. I'm Alex Martinez. I was once a poor kid who stood up in an English class because I couldn't bear to watch someone else be humiliated. Now I'm a writer, a mentor, a voice for those whose stories often go untold. What will your story be? The notebook sits on my desk as I write these final words. Its blue leather worn and creased with years of use. I open it to the inscription on the first page. For Alex, who showed us what courage looks like. I run my fingers over the faded ink, thinking about all the stories contained within these pages, both the ones I've written and the one I've lived, about how a single moment can echo through years, touching lives in ways we never anticipated. And I add one final line to the notebook, a reminder to myself and anyone else who might need to hear it. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway. It's about standing alone when necessary, but creating the conditions where no one has to stand alone for long. Because that's what happened, isn't it? I stood alone for a moment, but not for long. Maddie's voice joined mine, then Troy's, then others. What began as one solitary stand became a chorus, a community, a change. That's how it always works. One voice breaks the silence, making it safer for others to join in. One person takes a stand, showing others it can be done. Maybe that voice will be yours. I hope it is. The world needs it more than ever. I've been thinking about that day in Mrs. Wilson's class a lot recently, as I prepare to graduate and move into the next chapter of my life. I've been offered a position with a publishing house in New York, focusing on amplifying diverse voices in literature. It's an incredible opportunity, a dream job really, but it would mean leaving Portland, leaving my family, the nonprofit, the community that has shaped and supported me. Last week I visited my old middle school. Mrs. Wilson had invited me to speak to her current 6th grade class about writing, about finding your voice. As I walked the familiar hallways, now seeming so much smaller than they did in my memory, I was struck by how much had changed, and how much remained the same. The classrooms had been updated with new technology, the walls freshly painted, but the dynamics of middle school social hierarchies were instantly recognizable. The confident kids commanding attention, the quiet ones shrinking into themselves, the invisible barriers between different groups. I stood at the front of Mrs. Wilson's classroom, not the same room where our story unfolded. She'd moved to a larger space years ago, and looked out at 30 fresh faces staring back at me with varying degrees of interest, skepticism, and boredom. "How many of you think you have a story worth telling?" I asked. A few hands shot up immediately, the confident ones, sure of their place in the world. Others remained firmly down, but it was the hesitant hands, the ones that rose halfway and hovered there, uncertain, that caught my attention. "I'm going to let you in on a secret," I told them. "Everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone. And no one can tell your story but you." I shared a version of the tale you've just read. Not the full complexity of it. They were 6th graders after all, with the attention spans to match. But the essential truth. How a moment of standing up had rippled outward in ways I could never have predicted. How finding my voice had led me here, to a life built around words and stories. As I spoke, I watched their faces. Some were clearly engaged, leaning forward, eyes wide. Others maintained careful masks of indifference, too cool to show interest but listening nonetheless. A few stared out the window, or at their desks, lost in their own thoughts. But there was one boy in the back corner who never looked away, dark-haired, serious-eyed, wearing clothes that had seen better days. I recognized myself in him immediately. After the talk, as the students filed out for lunch, he hung back, approached my desk with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned to navigate the world cautiously. "Mr. Martinez?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have a question." "Just Alex is fine," I told him. "What's your question?" He hesitated, weighing his words. "How did you know that it was worth it, to speak up that day?" The question caught me off guard with its precision, its depth. This wasn't a child asking for writing tips or publishing advice. This was something more fundamental. "I didn't," I admitted. "I was terrified. I thought I was probably making a huge mistake." He nodded, absorbing this. "So how did you do it anyway?" I considered my answer carefully, knowing that whatever I said might matter to this serious-eyed boy in a way I couldn't fully anticipate. I think I just reached a point where staying silent felt worse than whatever might happen if I spoke up. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "But here's what I've learned since then. It's almost always worth it. Not because you'll always get the outcome you want. Not because everyone will suddenly change. But because each time you speak up for what's right, you become more fully yourself." He nodded again, processing. "I write stories too," he said finally, "but nobody knows." "Would you want to share one with me?" I asked. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by cautious hope. He pulled a worn spiral notebook from his backpack, flipped it open to a page covered in neat, cramped handwriting, and handed it to me. The story was about a boy who could see things others couldn't, not ghosts or monsters, but the sadness people carried inside them, manifesting as different colored lights around their bodies. The boy didn't know what to do with this ability until he realized he could absorb some of the sadness, lightening others' burdens but taking on the weight himself. It was raw, unpolished, but showed remarkable insight and empathy for a 12-year-old writer. "This is really good," I told him, meaning it. "You have a gift." He ducked his head, but not before I caught the smile he was trying to hide. "You think so?" "I know so. Keep writing. Keep telling your stories. They matter." As he left, Mrs. Wilson, who had been grading papers in the corner, approached. "That's Miguel," she said softly. "Brilliant kid. Tough home situation. She gave me a knowing look. Reminds me of someone. I nodded, understanding all too well. The writing program at the community center, I said. It's still running. I could get him information about it if you think he'd be interested. I think that would make a world of difference. And just like that, another ripple, another possibility created. Later that evening, as I sat with my mom at our kitchen table, mulling over the New York job offer, I told her about Miguel and his story. What do you think I should do? I asked her. About New York. She studied me thoughtfully. This woman who had worked herself to exhaustion for years to give her children opportunities she never had. You know I'll support whatever you decide, she said. But I think you already know the answer. And I did. The publishing job was a good opportunity, but there was important work to be done right here in Portland. Kids like Miguel with stories burning inside them, needing someone to tell them those stories matter. The nonprofit that had given me my start, now facing new funding challenges. The community that had shaped me, that still needed advocates and bridge builders. New York would always be there, but this moment, this opportunity to continue the ripple effect in the place where it all began, this was unique. I called the publishing house the next day and respectfully declined their offer. Instead, I accepted a position with a local literary arts organization, working to bring creative writing programs to underserved schools across the state. The salary was less, the prestige factor considerably lower, but it felt right. It felt like the next chapter of a story that had begun that day in Mrs. Wilson's class, a story not just about finding my own voice, but about helping others find theirs. Life rarely offers us neat, cinematic endings. No swelling music as the credits roll, no tidy resolution of all plot threads, just the continuing journey, the ongoing choice to align our actions with our deepest values, to speak up when it matters, to recognize the humanity in others and in ourselves. So that's where my story stands now. Not an ending, but a continuation. Another choice made, another path taken, another ripple expanding outward in ways I can't yet see. And your story? It's still being written too. In the choices you make today. In the moments when you decide to speak or stay silent. Stand up or look away. Extend a hand or close a door. Choose wisely. Choose kindly when you can. Choose bravely when you must. Because you never know who's watching, who needs to see that it can be done. You never know whose life might change direction because you had the courage to stand when everyone else sat silent. I'm living proof of that. The poor kid from Oakwood Heights who found his voice defending a nerdy classmate and ended up finding himself in the process. What's your story going to be? If this story touched something in you, take a deep breath and hit that like button. Subscribe to see more stories of everyday courage and unexpected heroes. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you found your voice? Or what's holding you back from using it? This community is built on shared stories and shared courage. I can't wait to hear yours. Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest ripples, and it's never too late to be the person you wish you'd had in your corner when you needed them most. This is Alex Martinez, signing off. But the story continues. It always does.